Alright, so let's go ahead and get this taken care of. It was absolutely important and imperative that we address this SAM matter. I have in my collection a book that is actually the acquisition manual. It is the Federal Department of Defense Acquisition Regulation Manual from, by the way, 2012, which means this is the 10th year. So insofar as it covers appropriations that were laid down in 2012, now is a very important year, including how certain things are going to be implemented this year, presumably for a different kind of characterization for the next year, which is how I understand federal defense appropriations. Contract awards are one thing, but in terms of actual appropriations for specific areas with expectations of performance, 10-year periods are very important. This is information I got when I was in Chicago. And the antipathy and the specific kind of sentiment that I'm expressing today is just absolutely natural. Why? Because of what happened in November of last year. I have right now my notes from November 17th, which means it would have been 10 days before now. Today is May 27th, right? We all may or may not know what happens with their 72-27 flip. I've been dealing with this for years. But on November 17, 2021, I was reviewing a case that's called the lottery case, Champion versus Ames from 1903. The thing about this case is it talks about the role of the state in regulating in order to suppress things that could be considered injurious to the moral or turpitude or the moral welfare of the people, such as gambling in the course of a lottery. Now, this was something that talked about lottery tickets that were purchased for a lottery in another state within a separate state. There's a lottery in another state, but you're able to purchase the tickets in this state. And this case actually lays down a very good foundation for the action of states which, for the protection of the public morals, prohibit the drawing of lotteries as well as the sale or circulation of lottery tickets. So this, to me, is a very important case for consideration in the context of allowing for people in our lives to be used in bidding schemes for somebody else's procurement, including of a contract, the terms of which we've not been exposed to and the terms of which have not been disclosed to us, and yet somehow we're supposed to perform in terms of some obligation, like the 40-year I was talking about. 1986, the United States government passed a law, piece of legislation regarding the military pension system. There was a report by the CRS that was actually in a publication. They used to do things differently back then than they do now. In this publication, there were two things of note. First, there was an examination of the United States role in Central America. This was in the context of a number of inquiries that had been put into effect regarding the situation between the United States and Nicaragua. And there was actually a Senate effort, I think it originated in the Senate, to actually have hearings on the situation in Central America. Not so ironically, former Vice President and now President was actually very important in that effort regarding these investigations into matters in Central America. But that same year, Congress passed a piece of legislation regarding the military pension system. And in this report, what it says is that the specific proposal that they had approved, but included a 40-year outlay in regards to the development of the American military pension system, but only accounted for income for 35 years. Which means the final 5 years of that system, at the time they passed it, they knew they did not have any expectation or understanding. They could not confirm how they were going to receive income in order to match or the expectations of the performance of the system. Now, ironically, if you read the book by former Congressman DioGuardio, and you also look through some of the information that's available regarding the congressional appropriations process, including its relationship to things like the trust that are Medicare and Social Security, and or the ways in which they work with pension systems, you're not allowed to account for pension obligation in that kind of a manner. Later information, including in what would be considered private pension schemes, would not have allowed for such a thing to have occurred. I contend whoever wrote that report knew this. They knew at the time the government was placing a bet a long-term 40-year bet. Now, right now, we are in the course of what would be the 35th, the 36th year of that 40-year outlay. That means we're in the process right now of having to deal with the final 5 years on that 40-year commitment. There was some discussion about raising the congressional budget ceiling, I think around 2012. And at that time, there was some information about the impact it could have on the military pension system. I contend what they were talking about was an understanding that if they raised the congressional ceiling, the budget ceiling, then what it would do would allow for them to lean more heavily on things up to and including the military pension system. And what that would do is it would redistribute, it would circulate so-called military benefits into and through civilian pension schemes, and that they actually coordinated and intentionally set up elements of the Affordable Care Act, including in local state marketplaces, to manipulate state pension schemes so that they could acquire that. And so they could recirculate it out to people. And now what they're actually doing is they're laundering the military pension scheme through this whole orchestration regarding COVID-19. So so-called civilians in the so-called medical sector, or so-called first responders that may or may not have their own critique or their own relationship with American military policy, are being availed of the benefits of the laundering of through the pension system to other people. And this is completely connected to our relationship to Afghanistan, but I'll get to that another time. Why do I mention this? On November 27th of 2021, I did a review in a book that was produced by the Marine Corps Association of the history of the United States Marine Corps. And I went through the 20s, starting with the 20s and going up through the 30s, specifically identifying if there were correlations in the cases or the specific pattern I was tracking with the Marine Corps in Nicaragua, and there are. Going all the way back to the 20s. Now, I did this in 2021 with an understanding that we were in a period of that later 5 years. It just so happens that the 40th anniversary on the military pension scheme correlates with the beginning of the American intervention in Nicaragua from the 1920s. And I contend they absolutely knew this in the 80s. Now, I have several pages here where there are dates, they're that specific, that come up in regards to information about the history of the Marine Corps specifically in Nicaragua. I also have information in here about how events predating that intervention in Nicaragua are directly connected to events now ongoing in Honduras. I contend they knew this. I contend they knew this 40 years ago. And in a lot of manners, much of global policy has been developed and manipulated accordingly. Now, the actual co-conspiracy or cooperation of state actors in Nicaragua or Honduras has not been identified. But if I'm not mistaken, isn't the former president of Honduras right now in the United States, presumably because he's been charged with being a kingpin in a criminal drug enterprise? Just so you know, I filed charges to consider both Barack Obama and Donald Trump for those very charges. And on February 23rd, my intent was to extend that to now also indict Joseph Biden, just so you know. But at the same time, if we're actually talking about having to deal with this, a great deal of what is happening right now is that somebody knew in the 80s when they passed that pension scheme that they intended for its term to come due on what would be the 100th anniversary of the intervention in Nicaragua. Did they know that before they started escalating this intervention in Nicaragua in the 80s? I contend they did. And that was the format that we've been working with. Right now we're in a situation where many members of the gas and oil sector are supposed to be paying on short-term 5-year loans. They were actually supposed to start paying on them in 2019. But since COVID-19, what they've done is they've reworked those schemes. Somehow they got refinancing. And a lot of those loans are supposed to run concurrent to the final 5 years in here. Some of them, I understand, were supposed to start getting paid back in February 2002. But at the same time, they've been correlating that with some of the things that they've been talking about ostensibly around the Brexit. And following the Brexit, the change to the Libor Index. If you've actually read the information about what they've been doing with the Libor Index, I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned that they're being disingenuous. I don't think they're actually going to do anything to address the decommissioning of the Lieber Index. I think they're just going to flip it. And my concern is that in flipping it, what they're going to do is they're going to take these rituals of persecution that other people have been using to justify their own praxis when it comes to making justifications for ethnic cleansing and things like hate crimes in order to finance whatever their scheme is. And they're just going to flip it. That they're not even necessarily going to change the characterizations. They're just going to allow for somebody else to play them. They'll get to move into performing as one group of people. Somebody else will be targeted as the other group of people, but they're not actually going to change the scheme. Now, the thing about it is we actually have the possibility to reconcile a lot of these matters if we actually pay attention to deal with it. But at the same time, what more can I fucking do? I've been doing the same thing consistently for 5 years. I still don't have a person to talk to. When you don't talk to me, what that does is it increases the leverage somebody else has, because it looks like all this stuff they put on me ended up defaulting. It didn't. But a human being only has so much tolerance for this kind of bullshit, right? I'm only one person, right?